Oh, I'm Betsy Bowman. I'm one of the co-founders of the Center for Global Justice. My husband, Bob Stone, and Cliff Duran and I founded the center 20 years ago. We lost Cliff this year, and um, Bob is having health problems, but we all seem to be getting older every year. Unfortunately, but we're still in the fight, in the struggle. Our educational programs in the over the first 20 years of the Center for Global Justice focused a lot on, what is neoliberalism? How is the economy, how is the US and the global economy organized? Our original impetus was to come and see how NAFTA was affecting Mexico, which we quickly learned was an absolute disaster for Mexico. And of course, now that's not at all a controversial statement anymore. I mean, we all know that neoliberalism is a disaster for not just countries in the third world, but for countries around the world, and certainly for the United States. As Today's talk is about participatory economics, and we as socialists are looking for a better way to organize the economy. Now, you don't have to be a socialist to think that maybe there's a better way to organize the economy. I mean, that's not a very controversial statement anymore either. Capitalism has not exactly delivered and brought prosperity to the great masses. It has actually taken prosperity away from the great masses in what's called the first world. Anyway, why participatory economics? Well, there's got to be a better way to organize the economy than to have it being organized in such a way as all of the benefits of ownership and productivity go to the top 1%, or to the elites. Actually, it's far less than just 1%. The widening wealth gap we see is adversely affecting our democracy, our very democracy, our economy, our lives, our environment. The profit imperative is driving us to keep extracting oil and gas and ruining the environment. But as socialists, we wonder, how can you plan an economy? So far, well, in the United States, it's the Pentagon that plans the economy essentially. In the Soviet Union, it was central planning that planned the economy, and that didn't work out so well either. So Robin has been working for 30, 40 years on the idea of a participatory economy, where average people are agents in their own lives and participate in the planning. Obviously, if we had participatory planning, we might not have nuclear power plants. We might not spend all of our government resources on the military. We might build cars that are electric vehicles rather than these giant gas guzzling SUVs, which are more profitable, of course, than other cars. So the idea of participatory economics and having people participate in the planning of both investment and distribution is what we're interested in. Robin is one of the pioneers of this idea and has done huge amounts of work to promote this idea. And we're extremely happy that he has decided to come to San Miguel for a little vacation and speak to us. He wrote me last October and said, "Hey, I can come in January. Would that be okay?" I said, "Yeah, great," And he'd been on a couple trips to Cuba with Cliff. And so he came on down from Portland, Oregon, where he now lives, to share with us his thoughts on, or his recent work on participatory economics. So I'm very happy to introduce Robin, Professor Emeritus from American University in Washington, D.C., and a friend of the Center for Global Justice. And obviously, his work inspires our work in the social and solidarity economy in our little neck of the woods here. So, welcome.
Betsy, your work inspires mine too. I'm delighted to be here. I thought I would have been here at some point in the last 20 years, but it just didn't quite work out. And very sorry I didn't make it here before Cliff's untimely demise. I actually knew Cliff even before a couple of trips to Cuba that he was the chief organizer for, because he was a professor, as I'm sure most of you know, in Baltimore when I was in Washington, D.C. And yes, we ran across each other in a number of left activities, anti-war activities, way back in that time period. Also, it's Martin Luther King Day. So it's finally an official holiday in the United States. We used to only have our official holidays for Lincoln's birthday, Washington's birthday. After World War I, they did put in Memorial Day. And even before I was born, they put in Labor Day. But of course not May 1st, because that would have been reminding people about the massacre of workers in Chicago. So the United States said, well, okay, to the labor movement in the United States, you can have a Labor Day, but you can't have it on May 1st when the rest of the world celebrates labor. So I'm pleased to be here on this day also. So I'm going to talk about a model of socialism that I've been working on for going on 50 years now, for many, many decades, along with Michael Albert, and now with many other people, some of whom are attending this talk, we think. We have working groups in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, where we're trying to essentially figure out 20th century socialism clearly had problems. What kinds of things do we need to learn how to do differently? So let me just jump in. Oh, on the subject of Ejidos. So I was asked whether or not I could also speak to something that is part of the work of the center here, working, with various people in this region and around Mexico. And I'll just tell you, I am coming more as the student than the professor on that subject. One of the best classes I ever took was a class on 20th century Mexican history. And the part of that history that most intrigued me, way back in 1966, was the history of Ejidos and the role that the Ejidos played during the Mexican Revolution. So I chose to write my term paper on that subject. That was 1966. And a lot has happened to Ejidos, and a lot of people here know a lot more about Ejidos than I do. But I will talk a little bit about that toward the end. Socialists have been talking about an alternative to capitalism for over 200 years now. Beginning in the Soviet Union in 1917, there were attempts in which many countries tried to create socialist economies, all of which failed, more or less miserably, to live up to expectations. And of course, we socialists for 100 years have been talking about the details of more and less miserably and what the causes of all that are. But I'm just going to jump to, well, okay, what important lessons have we learned? What should we socialists be at pains to avoid? And what kinds of things should we now be proposing? I'll tell you a little bit about my own personal journey in that venture. Actually, while we were on scaffolding painting houses in Boston, Michael Albert and I started talking about this. And we thought, well, the first thing is to be clear about what our goals are. What exactly does economic democracy, economic justice, economic efficiency, solidarity, variety, these are all things that we want from our economy. But what do they mean? Because it turns out, and I'm more convinced than ever after 30, 40 years of working on this, it turns out that designing an economy to achieve these goals often depends on exactly what did you mean by those high-sounding phrases. Now, in the early years, we concentrated on the major features of a system of annual participatory planning, in which we wanted to be sure that worker and consumer councils together plan their interrelated activities in a way that is qualitatively different from both central planning and coordination by markets. Now, more recently, I've gone on to address some additional subjects, such as investment planning, different kinds of long-run development planning, strategic international economic planning, and reproductive activity. Started to address those things recently, more recently, and quite honestly, when I propose things in those areas, that's more recent work. And I propose them much more in the spirit of, these are ideas. These are ideas for everybody to be thinking about, tinkering with, and I won't be in the least bit surprised if some of the things that I proposed more recently in those areas just turn out to be unique. They need to be changed, modified in some way. One place that we had not looked in detail more carefully is the agricultural sector and distinct features that characterize the agricultural sector. But I've long believed that there's no better place to start this journey than reviewing the history of the Ejidos, the Mexican Revolution. So I'm beginning my intellectual journey into agriculture here in San Miguel, where, as I said, I'll be more student than teacher sometimes. I'm going to take you on a not brief enough tour through sort of the major features of a participatory economy. I think the early socialist vision was right. Many early socialists, including Marx, believed that once workers wrested the means of production from the clutches of capitalists, workers would prove capable of planning together how to put them to good use, democratically, fairly, efficiently. What I now believe, looking back on 20th century history, and thinking a lot about how to do all that, is that a great deal of the devil is in the details. That doesn't mean I'm not more convinced than ever that it can be done. And therefore, to continue to allow markets to coordinate our interconnected economic activities inefficiently and unfairly, while inflicting unsustainable damage on the natural environment, or to empower a planning authority to do so, is both unnecessary and unwise. And I think the most important contribution those of us who advocate for the model of a participatory economy have made is to explain concretely how to reconcile comprehensive democratic planning with an appropriate degree of autonomy for workers in their workplaces and consumers in their neighborhoods. And I'm also more convinced than ever that failure to do so was what I really see as the Achilles heels of historic attempts to build socialism during the 20th century. So basically what we've tried to do in various publications over the past 4 decades is to propose ideas about how to carry out participatory annual planning, investment planning, long-run development planning without markets or a central authority, allowing worker and consumer councils and federations to manage themselves in socially responsible ways, and to achieve outcomes that are fair, efficient, and environmentally sustainable. I mean, this graphic is just sort of to paint a visual picture. You can have economic systems that are market systems. That's, of course, most economies today, including models of market socialism. And of course, you can have centrally planned economies, the traditional Soviet Union, and Cuba still. And the idea is, well, wait a minute, there's a whole third way to go about this. Some form of participatory planning. If you ask me, well, when did anybody ever try that? Spanish anarchists in the 1930s under very, very difficult circumstances. Let me just skip over that. I never know what these pictures do. I'm one of the people who, I look at a picture like this, it does nothing for me. And yet, I know that's not true for most of it. Having taught for decades, I know sometimes visual image is very important to the way people's minds work. Well, here is the idea is, well, in a participatory economy, you have these workers' councils, self-governing democratic workers' councils. You have neighborhood consumer councils. You have federations of consumer councils. You have federations of workers' councils. Then you have a planning procedure assisted by something. It's the worst. Sometimes when you pick names for things, they turn out to be good names. Iteration facilitation board, that's a clunker. We're still looking for something to call it that doesn't sound quite so clunky. Okay, I'm going to give you a run through about how it is that annual participatory planning works. Here's the challenge. How can you empower worker and consumer councils while protecting the interests of others in the economy who are affected by what these councils are going to do? How can you get a group of workers what I call user rights over parts of society's productive commons without allowing them to benefit unfairly from productive resources that belong to all? We'll come back to this when we look at agriculture and the use of land and Ejidos. Socialists have long understood that what one group in an economy does will inevitably affect many others, and therefore that all should have a say regarding all economic decisions, broadly speaking, in theory. That's something that socialists have understood for a long, long time. But different economic decisions do not usually affect everyone to the same extent. You can almost say that's the rub. How can we give people decision-making power to the degree they are affected by different kinds of economic decisions? How can we give workers and consumers and their councils an appropriate degree of autonomy over what they do? Now, this is just a brief, the next 3 slides are just going to take you through a brief little view of how our annual participatory planning procedure works. The first step is something you might call prices are announced. This clunky thing called an iteration facilitation board announces its current estimates of the opportunity costs of using all the different kinds of natural resources in the economy, all the different kinds of labor, and all the different capital goods that are available for use, as well as current estimates of the social cost of producing all goods and services. So there's a preliminary announcement of the estimates of what those things are. Second step, neighborhood consumer councils and worker councils make proposals about what they want to do. They don't make proposals about what they think the whole economy should do. They just make proposals about what they would like to do. So the consumer councils respond by making consumption requests and reporting what the income is of the consumers in that neighborhood. Worker councils respond by making production proposals. Now, for an economist, what a production proposal consists of is, well, what are the outputs that you propose to make? And what are the inputs that you're going to need permission to use in order to do that? The third step is the estimates of the opportunity and social costs get updated by the iteration facilitation group. All it has to do is add up all the demands for and the supplies for each final good, intermediate good, capital good, natural resource category of labor. This is all economics talk. And adjust its estimate of its opportunity or social cost up or down in proportion to the degree of the excess demand or supply for that during the last planning, during the last round of proposals. If you do that over and over again, this procedure is going to lead to a reduction in the excess supplies and demands until there is something that economists call a feasible plan. Here's something finally we've all agreed on, and if we carry it out, it can be done. Each round in this, it's a social iterative procedure. It's going to begin with new, more accurate estimates of opportunity and social costs. Each council, worker council, neighborhood consumption council is going to have to revise and resubmit its own proposal for what it wants to do until it meets with approval from other councils and federations. There is no central authority with the power to approve, reject, or revise any council's proposals. Now, in the absence of that authority, if you're not already asking yourself, well, why are they going to revise things? You should be. Consumption council proposals are evaluated by multiplying the quantity of every good or service requested by the estimated social cost of producing it. And then that proposal gets compared to the average effort rating plus allowances of the members of the households in that consumption council that are making the request. Production proposals from worker councils are evaluated by comparing the estimated social benefits of what they say they are willing to produce compared to the estimated social costs of using all of those scarce inputs that they say they need to use. Well, who's going to say no to a proposal? It's a really key question. Well, the magic in this, if there's a magic in our proposal, if there's a spark of genius in this is where it is. Everyone making proposals could easily see if a consumption council or a worker council proposal is socially responsible, thereby eliminating the need of a central authority to approve or disapprove the proposals. Consumer councils requesting more than is warranted by their effort ratings and allowances discover they're going to be forced to shift their request to less socially costly items or reduce the amounts they request if they expect to win approval from other councils. Worker councils whose outputs are less beneficial than the social cost of producing them discover they're going to be forced to shift toward producing to a more desirable mix of outputs to a less socially cost mix of inputs, or they're going to have to increase their efforts if they expect to win approval for their proposals from all these other councils. I'm going to skip over this slide to move us forward. I'm going to say a really brief word about opportunity costs. This is a huge bugaboo amongst leftists and economists. There's a long, ongoing debate about, do we need these things? Do we not need these things? And what are they? And how would you ever generate any reasonably accurate estimates of the opportunity costs and social costs? I'd just like to say that no other proposal that I know of in the literature for how to conduct comprehensive democratic economic planning has successfully dealt with the problem of how to generate reasonably accurate estimates of the opportunity costs of using scarce productive inputs, including inputs from the natural environment. No other proposal generates reasonably accurate estimates of the social costs of producing goods and services. And in contrast, the procedures we've designed are generated to do that, to do exactly that. Why is this important? Well, without accurate estimates of opportunity and social costs, it's impossible to know how to allocate scarce productive resources efficiently. Now, most economists readily acknowledge that. But what may be even more important, and maybe of greater interest to us leftists, is that without them, it's impossible for worker and consumers to participate sensibly in economic decision-making without undue impositions on their time. Unless they're provided with reasonably accurate estimates of opportunity and social costs, workers can't know if their own work proposals are socially responsible. Think of it, I'm in a workers' council. I want to propose to do something that's actually socially responsible. How am I going to know if what I propose is socially responsible? I don't think there's any way for workers in their own council to know that without reasonably accurate estimates of opportunity costs of using the different inputs that are proposing to use. And I don't think consumers can know whether their consumption requests are socially responsible without these. But maybe the most important thing is, without reasonably accurate estimates of opportunity and social costs, nobody can know whether or not to approve or disapprove what others propose to do. But if you have these, if you have reasonably accurate estimates of opportunity and social costs, worker and consumer councils and federations can engage in socially responsible collective self-management without a central authority to boss them around and without some market forces and without excessive burdens on their time. Okay, so that's sort of a blitzkrieg through sort of the idea of participatory planning. I'm going to go quickly through how it is that this participatory planning process now handles the natural environment. Look, like most socialists, I came to environmental awareness belatedly, for which I apologize. But I've been teaching environmental economics and publishing articles and books in that field for more than 3 decades now. Trying to make up, for my backwardness, initial backwardness. And what we've now managed to incorporate into this planning procedure that I just described is what economists call a pollution demand revealing mechanism. And what we've managed to prove is that under standard assumptions, this mechanism will treat environmental externalities in a reasonable way. The key is we've added a new group of actors into the annual planning process. We call them communities of affected parties. And they play around in every round of proposals in that annual planning procedure, right along with the worker councils and the consumer councils. Everybody affected by a particular pollutant are members of one of these communities of affected parties. The idea is that I'm affected by this pollutant. I'm one of the people who's affected by this pollutant. Along with all the other opportunity and social costs, the Iteration Facilitation Board also announces estimates of how much damage a unit of a pollutant causes. It's their provisional estimate. Worker councils must include in their proposals how many units of this pollutant they propose to emit, for which they're going to expect to be charged the estimate of the damage that it causes. The community of affected party proposes how much of the pollutant they are willing to be exposed to if their members are compensated for damage. So we're putting the victims of pollution in the driver's seat. We're saying, unless you give permission to be subjected to a pollutant, you just say no. Can't be emitted. On the other hand, it's almost impossible to produce things without generating some degree of some kinds of pollution. So our proposal is we give the effect, anybody who's going to be negatively affected by a pollutant, we're going to put them in the driver's seat. If they want to say no, they can say no. If they want to say, well, okay, we'll allow for a certain amount of that, but we have to be compensated for the damage that's going to cause us. That's basically the logic of how it is that we're incorporating the cost of pollutants into the economy. So what does this mechanism do? It reduces pollution to reasonably efficient levels. That is, it allows emissions up to the point where the marginal social cost of emissions is equal to their marginal social benefit. I know that's economics talk. As an economist and a leftist, I think that's valid. It satisfies the polluter pays principle. Worker councils who are polluting when they produce things, they get charged for the damage their emissions generate, just as they're charged for using labor, natural resources, and intermediate capital goods. It compensates the victims of pollution by giving them consumption credit for damages suffered. So where do you get income in our economy? Well, you get income from working, according to your efforts and sacrifices. You also get some income if you're part of a community of affected parties who is damaged by some form of pollution. But most importantly, what this mechanism does is it induces victims of pollution to truthfully reveal the cost of pollution, because this mechanism is what economists call incentive compatible. So this picture just includes the communities affected parties along with all the other actors in the planning procedure. Here's a really important caveat. Devising a pollution demand revealing mechanism that's incorporated into the planning procedure that will induce victims to reveal truthfully how much they believe pollution will damage them, and then to make adjustments, taking that into account. It's not a trivial intellectual accomplishment. As far as I know, I don't think there's another post-capitalist model that has managed to do this. But this mechanism is useful only for pollutants whose effects are relatively well understood by the victims. And most importantly, do not primarily affect future generations who can't be present when we're doing annual planning. Obviously, there are many pollutants, most prominently greenhouse gas emissions, which do not fit this description. So I'm not claiming that we've taken care of all the pollution issues in this way. They got to be taken care of in a different way, which I'll describe in a second. What we've done now is propose how to create and revise long-run environmental plans to address pollutants which will affect many generations who could not be present when the plans are created. So I'm going to talk a little bit about long-run development planning, which include, and one form of long-run development planning is environmental planning. So in part 5 of the most recent book, Democratic Economic Planning, what I proposed is, and again, I said in the introduction, this is just out there in the last few years. I expect there's some things wrong with it. Has to be discussed. But unless you have concrete proposals, there's nothing to discuss. That's the motivation for doing this. Well, in chapter 13, we propose how we might go about doing, economists used to call this manpower plan. And I worked in Cuba at one point with some people on the question of, well, how are the Cubans planners going to go about doing manpower planning? It was back in the early 70s. Now it's called education planning. We certainly need to do long-run environmental planning. And in chapter 15, I talk about doing something you can call long-run international economic planning. What are these long-run plans? What are these long-run plans intended to achieve? What we've tried to do is design proposals that will maximize popular participation by consumer and worker federations, taking both access to information and motivation of participants into account. Try to design them so they induce participants to behave as honest brokers for future generations who can't be present when these long-run plans are being drawn up and approved. That use results from subsequent annual plans to identify mistakes and estimations made during the formation of these long-run plans, and then to update the environmental plans in order to mitigate what otherwise would be welfare losses. I'm just going to say a couple of things about long-run plans. One thing which is very, very obvious to economists, and the other is much less obvious to anybody, including economists. So this first part is what's clear to economists. As soon as you recognize the practical necessity of creating short-run and long-run plans, then it's obvious that the results from long-term plans are needed by those creating the annual plans. For instance, before we do annual planning, we need to know how much of each capital good has to be produced during the year. How much more of capital goods do we have to produce in order to have capital goods in the future? You got to know that when you start to do your annual planning. You got to know what resources must be allocated to the educational system to train and teach various skills to the present and future workforce. You need to know what resources must be allocated to environmental protection and restoration. And you need to know what industries we are expanding or shrinking in order to transform an economy's comparative advantages in international division of labor. You got to know, you have to have the answers to all those things before you sit down to do the annual planning. Well, the answers to those things have to come from these long-term plans. And that's more or less straightforward. What's been less obvious is this. Results from annual planning can be used to identify mistakes in assumptions made when longer-term plans were first created. So those longer-term plans can be revised to reduce losses in well-being. When you're making plans for 30, 50 years in the future, you only have so much information available. And even if you design your system for generating the most accurate estimates of these things, you're clearly going to have mistakes. Well, if you have no way of catching the mistakes and correcting the mistakes, well, then you're going to have much worse results from your long-run planning. So I call them guesstimates. When you're making long-run plans, you're basing those plans on guesstimates of different things. When these guesstimates prove to be inaccurate, as they inevitably will be to some extent, investment and development plans will fail to maximize social well-being. They'll either call for too much or too little investment of different kinds. In this regard, I think our most important contribution to the literature, to the debate, to the thinking about all this is we've shown how the results from subsequent annual planning procedures reveal where errors were made in estimating future effects when the investment and development plans were initially created. So those investment and development plans can then be revised and improved. This is a significant accomplishment. I've not seen anybody else out there in the literature that's tackled this and sort of tackled this problem successfully. And think about it. If one cannot explain how it is that you can catch mistakes in your long-run plans that run over 30 years, if you can't explain how that can be done to minimize inevitable efficiency losses due to inaccurate estimates of future parameters when longer-term plans are created, the argument against comprehensive planning is strengthened. You want to strengthen the case for people who say we can't do sensible planning. If you can't show them how you're going to catch inevitable mistakes and then make adjustments, then I think the case for long-term planning of any kind, including environmental plan, is seriously weakened. So we've proposed an answer to that problem now. I'm going to talk about one part of this. So out there in the debates about what are the alternatives to capitalism now in the 20th century, criticisms of our proposals for replacing markets with participatory planning. There are critics who say, well, it's very nice in theory, but it's impractical. And they've said it's impractical really for three different kinds of reasons. Some critics dismiss our proposals because they assume it's impossible to create what they call a detailed, comprehensive plan in the first place. For example, the Jacobin magazine dismissed our proposal as not worthy of discussion. And my good friend David Schweikert called it nonsense on stilts. Others, so that's a criticism that has to do with you just can't do this much planning at this level of detail that's necessary to do comprehensive planning. Others don't dispute that a comprehensive plan can be created, but do not believe it is possible to make adjustments in the plan quickly enough when unanticipated situations arise during the year, which they inevitably do. And a third group argues that while our iterative annual planning procedure may reach a feasible plan eventually, it would take so many iterations before a feasible plan is reached that our procedure would be impractical in any real-world application. So we've been listening to various forms of these three sort of doubts over many years now. I'm going to skip over the answer to the first two, okay? Both of which, quite frankly, I think are just not very well conceived. But the third problem, we took really seriously. Third problem was, okay, you've got this wonderful theoretical annual participatory planning procedure. I like it. Demonstrate under what circumstances you can prove it will achieve an efficient plan. You got all this self-managed proposal going on. Sounds great. But how many iterations is it going to take to get to a feasible plan? What if it takes 300 iterations? Well, then it's just totally fine. And when people raise that objection, when they raise that doubt, we said, you know, that's a reasonable doubt. Well, there's two ways to answer the question. One way is some country has to decide to do it. As you all know, no country has decided to do it yet. And the only other way that you can try and address that question in absence of a real world experiment is to try and do computer simulations. And after almost 10 years of working on this is what we found out so far. We actually have done some further work, but it has basically confirmed what was published in Chapter 9 of the Democratic Economic Planning book. There we present results from hundreds of computer simulations of annual participatory planning for an economy with 30,000 neighborhood consumer councils, 30,000 worker councils, 100 private goods, 100 public goods, 100 capital goods, 100 categories of labor, 100 different inputs from the natural environment. If you assume that there are 1,000 people in a consumer council, this represents an economy of approximately 30 million people. That's 3 times larger than the populations of Sweden, Austria, Portugal, or Cuba, approximately the size of Venezuela, Peru, Poland, Canada, or Australia, and roughly half the size of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, or Thailand. Very briefly, what were the results? In our computer simulation experiments, it never took more than 8 iterations to reach a feasible plan, and on average took only a little more than 5. Moreover, whenever we increased the number of iterations required did not increase as we increased the number of councils, the number of different kinds of goods, the number of different categories of labor, the number of different inputs from nature. Now look, more simulation work needs to be done, and we're actually doing it. But as far as results, so far results strongly suggest that this participatory iterative annual planning procedure cannot be dismissed as a practical impossibility, but instead appears to be quite practical. 5 to 8 iterations is something that worker and consumer councils could easily do during the month of December to have a new annual plan ready to go on January 1st. We finally get to the Ejidos. You've been very patient. Look, a while back I asked the following question. How can we give groups of workers user rights over parts of society's productive commons without allowing them to benefit unfairly from productive resources that belong to all? In this case, the workers we are talking about are farm workers, sometimes known as peasants. And the productive commons we are talking about is essentially agricultural. An agricultural worker council, is it just an ejido? Well, how will worker farmers get user rights to the land they want to use? Well, our proposal is that an agricultural worker council, these agricultural worker councils, or call them ejidos if you want, they'll request the land they want to use as one of the inputs they ask for permission to use during the annual planning process, knowing they'll be charged the opportunity cost of using it. Although clearly ejidos will be given first right to continue to use land that they've been using historically. There's no reason that can't be done. How's it going to be decided when, how, and who will plant, tend, and harvest? Well, members of an agricultural worker council or an ejido will manage their own work procedures and assignments as they see fit, although they will be encouraged to try to balance jobs for empowerment to make self-management more robust within the ejido. How will worker farmers in a worker council in a participatory economy be compensated? Well, in an agricultural worker council or an ejido, members will compensate one another as they see fit, just as workers do in all worker councils. They will be encouraged to create appropriate procedures to identify any differences and sacrifices members make in order to compensate those who exert greater effort or make greater sacrifices. They'll be encouraged to do that, but they do that as they see fit, to the extent that they see fit, in ways that they see fit, which is completely consistent with what we have said about workers in any worker council. Like any workers' council, they'll be required to limit the effort ratings they award one another, so the average effort rating awarded doesn't exceed the ratio of the estimate of the overall benefits of the Ejidos outputs divided by the overall social cost of the Ejidos inputs. Sort of a technical issue. Okay, I'm stopping it. This is the last slide. After many failures, it's understandable for people to doubt that participatory democratic economic planning is possible and desirable. It's also understandable that many anti-capitalists today would assume that we must make our peace with markets. It's easy to understand why plenty of people feel that way. So anyone who wants to argue for comprehensive democratic planning had better explain concretely and fully as they can just how they are proposing it be done. And essentially that's the task that some of us have put ourselves to for the past 30 years. And what we think we've done now is we've spelled out a concrete proposal for how to create, approve, and integrate annual plans, investment plans, and various long-run development plans. Explain why there is every reason to believe the results will be highly desirable. And we've spent the last 30 years trying to respond respectfully at length to various objections that people have raised. Thank you.